I'm Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you are watching Lawyer Up. In today's episode, we're going to talk about homicide law, and specifically we're going to look at murder and we're going to look at manslaughter. We're going to talk about how they're different and what the varying degrees within each subcategory actually mean. As a backdrop, we're going to use the charges that have been filed against Officer Chauvin in connection with the death of George Floyd up in Minneapolis, Minnesota on Memorial Day of 2020. Now, Floyd's family wanted him charged with first-degree murder. He was actually charged with third-degree murder. We're going to talk about the difference, and we're going to talk about whether those other three officers that basically just stood by, can they be charged with murder? Can they be charged with manslaughter? Well, we're going to answer those questions and more in today's episode. Remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And remember, I am a lawyer, but I am not your lawyer. If you need a lawyer specific to your legal situation, then you should lawyer up with an attorney in your area. Now, if you start with the overall concept of a homicide, that's simply the killing of another person. This can include legal and illegal types of killings. So specifically for what we're talking about today, we're going to be looking at the criminal type. We're going to be looking at murder, and we're going to be looking at manslaughter. Now, in its purest form, murder is simply the intentional and unjustified killing of another human being. Now, note it must have both elements. It must be intentional, and it also must be legally unjustified. You can have an intentional killing of another human being, but if it's legally justified, it's not murder. The classic example of this is a situation of self-defense. Somebody breaks into your house and they're coming after you, you pull out a gun and you shoot them dead. You could say, yeah, that was intentional. I intended to kill them. But because you are legally justified in defending yourself, it's not murder. Other examples would include a soldier during wartime, or maybe a member of a SWAT team who's responding to a mass shooting and they take out the assailant, and even the administration of the death penalty. These are intentional killings, but that are legally justified. So they're not considered murder. You can also have an unjustified taking of another human's life, but if it's not intentional, then it's also not murder. This is generally your accidental death scenarios. Maybe somebody comes up and hands you a gun and takes the clip out and tells you it's empty, and you think it's empty and pull the trigger. Uh-oh, there was one in the chamber and you killed somebody. That is an unjustified killing, of course, but because it wasn't intentional, it was accidental, then it's not murder. Now, the degree of your responsibility in the accident, that can lead to other criminal charges. If you are grossly negligent or reckless and a death occurs because of that, then you can be charged with what's called manslaughter. And so manslaughter in its purest form is the unintentional and unjustified killing of another human being, but where the defendant or the assailant acted with gross negligence or recklessness. And the classic example of manslaughter is the DWI accident where someone is killed. The individual who was operating the motor vehicle was driving drunk, lost control of the vehicle, and crashed into and killed someone else. Now, obviously, that wasn't intentional. The person didn't intend to kill the other person. But because they acted with gross negligence or recklessness, there is a criminal penalty for doing so. And that's the types of scenarios you see under manslaughter statute. So to summarize, murder is the intentional and unjustified killing of another human being, while manslaughter is the unintentional and unjustified killing of another human being. Now, I say it's in its purest form because states do all kinds of different things. So if you think you now understand murder and manslaughter, well then forget everything I just told you, because every single state does something entirely different. Some states will subdivide murder into various degrees, while other states do not. Likewise, some states subdivide manslaughter into first or second degree. Others call it voluntary or involuntary manslaughter. And states that have degrees often have more than one. You'll have first degree, second degree, even some states have a third degree murder statute. And what's even more complicated is the definitions of these different types of murder or manslaughter. They vary from state to state. What might be first degree murder in Missouri could be called third degree murder in New York. So the point is you always have to look at the specific state's statute anytime you're examining a murder or a manslaughter type situation. And since in this video we are examining the case against Officer Derek Chauvin, we need to look at the murder and the manslaughter statutes from the state of Minnesota where the offense took place. So let's set the scene. Now, if you're watching this video in 2020, you are well aware of the George Floyd murder. There are all kinds of riots going on, demonstrations, some peaceful, some not. So it's a big deal in the community right now. However, if you're watching this video 10 to 15 years down the road, you may not be as familiar with the scenario. So I'm going to describe the scene. It's Memorial Day of 2020 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And if you haven't seen the videos of this, I will tell you that it is disturbing. Very disturbing. That day, 4 Minneapolis police officers responded to a scene where a man by the name of George Floyd had allegedly tried to pass off a $20 bill that was counterfeit. As Mr. Floyd was being taken into custody by the 4 officers, when you get to the crux of the video, he is laying face down with his arms behind his back, handcuffed. And Officer Derek Chauvin is pressing his knee down on the back of Mr. Floyd's neck. Now, Officer Chauvin is putting not the full weight of his body, but the bulk of the weight of his body onto that knee, and he is pinning Mr. Floyd's head to the pavement because he's lying in the street next to a vehicle. Now, this goes on for 8 minutes, and during that time, George Floyd is screaming out in pain. He's screaming that he can't breathe. And at some point in time during the video, he falls silent. Eventually, he lays his head down, and a short time later, he is pronounced dead. The very next day, all 4 officers that were involved were fired from the Minneapolis Police Department. Within a week, Officer Chauvin had been charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter. The other 3 officers that were involved have yet to be charged. And the family of George Floyd wants all 4 of them charged with first-degree murder. But to examine and determine the appropriate charges, we need to look specifically at the Minnesota statutes that deal with murder and manslaughter. So interestingly, Minnesota is one of 3 states that have 3 degrees of murder. Most states only have 2, and some have none. They just call murder murder. But in Minnesota, they have 3 degrees. Now, first-degree murder is the intentional and unjustified killing of another human being that was premeditated. You usually hear words like cool deliberation and malice aforethought connected with first-degree murder charges. An example of a first-degree murder scenario would be where person A comes home, it's nighttime, and they flip on the lights in their kitchen, and there sits someone at the kitchen table with a gun. They raise the gun and boom, they shoot person A. Now, this is a first-degree murder scenario. Obviously, it was premeditated. That person had to think about how they were going to go about the killing. They had to break into the person's house. They had to sit there and wait for person A to come home before they killed them. So this is a classic example of a premeditated, intentional, and unjustified killing that would constitute first-degree murder. In Minnesota, the maximum penalty for first-degree murder is life in prison. Now, when we look at second-degree murder, which is considered less serious than first-degree murder, we see that it is the intentional and unjustified killing of another human being, but without premeditation. Or there's an additional scenario that falls under second-degree murder in Minnesota. It also includes any death caused during the commission of a dangerous felony. And the classic example of this is a drive-by shooting, where the defendant may say, well, I didn't intend to kill anybody. I was just shooting into the house and just trying to scare them. However, if you're involved in the commission of a dangerous felony and someone dies, in the state of Minnesota, they elevate that to second-degree murder. Elevate that to first-degree murder. But in Minnesota, the drive-by shooting scenario is second-degree murder. Second-degree murder is punishable by up to 40 years in jail in the state of Minnesota. Now we get to third-degree murder, and this is particularly relevant because this is what was charged. Third-degree murder is the unintentional and unjustified killing of another human being, but without regard to human life. And because this is the actual statute that the officer is charged with in this case, I'm going to read it to you. It says, in Minnesota, third-degree murder occurs when a person without intent to effect the death of any other person causes the death of another by perpetrating an act imminently dangerous and without regard for human life. So that is the statute that Officer Chauvin has been charged with in the George Floyd murder. Third-degree murder has a maximum punishment of 25 years in the Department of Corrections. From there, if you drop down in severity a notch, you get to first-degree manslaughter. In Minnesota, first-degree manslaughter is the intentional killing of another human being, but in the heat of passion. And the classic example of this one is same scenario from before. Person A comes home, they turn on the lights in the kitchen, they go back into the bedroom and they turn on the lights there, and they find their spouse and another person naked going at it in the bedroom. Well, they get really, really upset. They grab a gun and bam, bam, they nail them both. That is the example of an intentional killing, but it was done in the heat of passion. So normally the courts will look at a lesser culpability if it's a scenario that would cause a reasonable person to kind of lose their cool. Now, some states call this voluntary manslaughter. Minnesota refers to it as first-degree manslaughter, and the punishment for first-degree manslaughter is up to 15 years in prison or the Department of Corrections. And finally, in Minnesota, there is second-degree manslaughter. That is the unintentional and unjustified killing of another human being where the person exhibits gross negligence or recklessness. And as I mentioned before, this is the DWI crash where you cause a fatality scenario. In Minnesota, that type of a murder or a manslaughter is punishable by up to 10 years in the Department of Corrections. Also, there are a lot of states that refer to this as involuntary manslaughter. Some of it refer to it as negligent homicide, or even some states call it vehicular homicide. So when we go back and you look at the actions of the officer in this scenario, you have to ask yourself, does first-degree murder charges or second-degree murder charges fit? Those will require some sort of an intent to cause the death of Mr. Floyd. Now, while I understand that the family wants him punished to the maximum extent of the law, as a prosecutor, you have to be careful not to overcharge an individual. Because if you charge them with a crime that is beyond what they did, it's actually easier for them to prove remember, you only need one juror out of 12 that you are not guilty, or at least that the prosecution hasn't proved beyond a reasonable doubt that you are guilty. So if you're alleging that he intended the death of Mr. Floyd in this case, his defense would probably be simply that, well, I didn't intend for this to happen. It was an accident. I had pinned him down. I thought since he could talk, he could breathe, which we know is not necessarily true, but I had a mistaken idea about that, and so it wasn't intentional. So you don't want to overcharge a defendant because you run the risk of a jury finding that person not guilty of the crime. So you always want to, as a prosecutor, appropriately charge the defendant with the crime that you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed. Now, when you talk about third-degree murder in this case, the two things that the prosecutor are going to have to prove was, first, whether this death was caused by an act that's eminently dangerous. And I think that will be pretty easy to prove. He had his knee on the back of Mr. Floyd's neck. He had him pinned against the ground. Whenever Mr. Floyd would struggle, he would push him back down. Mr. Floyd was screaming that he couldn't breathe and that he was in pain. That type of activity going on for over 8 minutes is obviously eminently dangerous. And the second element, that this death was caused or that the officer acted without regard for human life. I think that would be easy to prove as well, because when you have a man screaming he can't breathe and you don't let up on him, I think you can definitely prove that the individual was acting without regard for human life. Now, did he intend this death? I think he would probably argue that he didn't. However, you don't have to have intent in a third-degree murder situation. So it would appear that third-degree murder is the most appropriate charge for prosecutors to bring against the officer in this case. So the next question is, what about the other 3 officers that were just standing around? Now, we have seen from videos that they initially helped bring Mr. Floyd into custody, so they participated in this scenario up to that point. And then while Officer Chauvin's knee was in the back of his neck, they basically stood guard and kept anybody else from being able to get involved in this scenario. Now, the obvious question is, well, they didn't actually put the pressure on his neck, so can they be somehow charged with murder? And the answer is yes. And the avenue for that is something called the felony murder rule. What the felony murder rule states is that during the commission of a dangerous felony, if someone is killed, then everybody that's involved, everybody in the conspiracy, is responsible for that death. And the classic example of this is the getaway driver. You're the getaway driver, your buddies are in there robbing the bank. Things go sideways, one of your buddies shoots a security guard and kills him, they jump in the car and you drive off. Everybody gets charged with murder. And you say, well, hey, wait a minute, I didn't pull the trigger, I didn't kill anybody. Doesn't matter. Under the felony murder rule, everybody involved is charged with all of the crimes of everybody else. It's the idea that if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. And if something goes sideways and you're participating in that dangerous felony, you are just as responsible as the person who pulls the trigger. So in this case, we look at the most serious act, and that is the third-degree murder that was perpetrated by Officer Chauvin. So by implication, could the other 3 officers in use of the felony murder rule be charged with murder as well? Well, the answer to that question is yes. It is possible they could be charged. Now, they haven't been yet, and the prosecutor may not charge them, but it is a possibility that all 4 of these officers could be charged with murder under the felony murder rule. Well, that's today's episode on homicide, specifically looking at murders and their degrees, manslaughter and their degrees, as well as applying the Minnesota criminal statutes to the case involving the death of George Floyd. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, do me a favor, hit that like button. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to learn more about the law. Share me on social media. I always appreciate that. And hey, if you got something to say to me, put it in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I'm Joshua Roberts, and you've been watching Lawyer Up.
Send lawyers, guns, and money. Dad, get me out of this.